Hi everyone, my name is Sara Small. I am a graduate student in the Department of History. I'll be earning my Master's of History, and my thesis is titled, If the Masters Be Cruel, Violence and Masculinity in Early Modern Caribbean. So keep an eye out for that in a couple months. I think with that, I'm going to go ahead and get started. So, just for a second, I'd like for everyone to close their eyes and imagine. It's a beautiful spring day, much like today. The scent of magnolias and freshly cut grass is in the air. You turn around and see all your family and friends. Open your eyes and welcome folks to your plantation wedding. Got a couple cute little images for you all there. All right, let's go ahead. So plantation weddings have been a trend for years. 1 in 5 engaged couples use Pinterest to help plan weddings in 2010. And if you are on a budget, just for our budget brides out there, a plantation wedding can cost as little as $9,000. And that budget wedding was way less than the average cost of a slave in 1840, which could run anywhere between $12,500 and $200,000 in today's money. Don't you love a discount? I do. You also have the chance to make history. People have been getting married on plantations for centuries, so why shouldn't you? Now is a couple of venues I've offered for your plantation weddings. If you'd like to experience Louisiana, check out the Stella Plantation. They don't deal with any of that pesky slavery talk there, so don't worry. But we do have a few historical facts. Their first sugar crop was harvested in 1815, leading to a very prosperous future for the plantation. Now you can hunt and stay in their various cottages. It's probably the closest you get to experiencing what it was like to live on an antebellum plantation. You can also check out Magnolia Plantation, which is just a hop and a skip away from New Orleans, if anyone's thinking bachelorette party, because I sure am. They've been hosting weddings since 1977, so you're part of a long tradition of people getting married there. And don't worry about any peculiar institutions. Take it from planter Robert Drake, who said in the 1860s, the workers liked harvesting sugar and rice for their master, and they always followed his advice. If you're not interested in a broad marriage, you can check out Cedar Plantation right here in Georgia. It holds a little piece of Southern history right here in our backyard and holds generations of memories. Cedar Plantation was built before the Civil War by E.L. Shuford, and Mr. Shuford held big parties for all his friends, just like you. Brides today are still calling it a beautiful wedding venue. Let's see. If you're looking for more of a luxurious vibe, you can check out South Eden, which is located right here in Thomasville, Georgia. It was originally known as the Colston Plantation and has been around since 1825. It's rooted in Southern history. After Reconstruction, the formerly enslaved people still lived on the plantation as sharecroppers. After that, 1,500 acres were transformed into private plantations, which are perfect for you and your family. It's a historic boutique resort, and South Eden still offers suites in what's known as the Big House. Fun fact, there were over 40,000 plantations in the antebellum United States. Shouldn't everyone have the chance to get married on one? If you want a couple of reviews, this is what people are seeing. This bride said that South Eden was breathtaking. Their plantation staff set up the ceremony and reception site, taking care of everything for you. Another bride said that she had an amazing wedding at Cedar Plantation. There are always people working on the house or the landscaping when she visited, which she appreciates. And lastly, a Bellmead Plantation located in Nashville, Tennessee, is a great place to get some Southern history. They said that they learned about how the South was involved in the horse racing business, and the change to a winery was a good decision. I personally think it's funny that TripAdvisor forgot to mention how slavery made horse racing possible, but that's just me. And on a more serious note, since black people are still being commodified and exploited in 2021, 160 years after slavery was abolished, let me give you a few figures. The Huma House Plantation, located in Louisiana, is up to 38 acres with more than 550 people enslaved there. Oak Alley Sugarcane Plantation in Louisiana has 25 acres with an unknown number of slaves. Sweet Home Plantation in Georgia has 100 acres with an unknown number of slaves. The Chantilly Cotton Plantation, also in Georgia, It's over 1,000 acre with an unknown number of people enslaved there, and the Stella Plantation, Louisiana, has 1,500 acres with an unknown number of slaves. And I didn't read this info in a book, people. It's right there on these plantation websites. All right. So, in all seriousness, this trend raises a serious issue. Why should you care? Plantations celebrate the culture of the perpetrators, and the popularity of plantation weddings demonstrate just how much we need responsible historical engagement. One plantation that has challenged or responded to these challenges of what to do with the plantation site is the Whitney Plantation. They have gone against the willful miseducation and erasure of Black history, which is inherently American history. And I'll have a little blurb from the Whitney Plantation Instagram a bit later. This can be seen in questions by tour leaders at plantation museums, and it's important to remember the historical context. What did marriage and family life look like? So, this review raises the question of a potential failure of education. They wrote that, did the slaves here appreciate the care that they got from their mistress? So people tend to think that slaveholders took care of their slaves out of the goodness of their hearts rather than out of economic interest. Another person asked, they lived in a nice house here and they weren't being beaten. Do we know why they, referring to enslaved people, wanted to leave? So people know that field slavery was bad, but they tend to think that household slavery was pretty all right, if not an outright sweet deal. And lastly, this person said, if you think about it economically, enslaved people don't work as hard if you don't feed them. People also don't understand how prejudice influenced slaveholders' actions beyond mere economic interest in preserving slavery. These reviews all come from a person who worked as a tour guide at a plantation site, and she says that she was occasionally asked what motivation slaveholders would have had for beating, starving, or otherwise maltreating enslaved workers. All right. So what did marriage and family life look like for enslaved people on antebellum plantations? First, I have a couple of books I would like to recommend for people who are more interested in this. One is Joining Places, Slave Neighborhoods in the Old South by Anthony Kay, and A History of the Freedmen's Bureau by George R. Bentley. Bentley's book is a bit outdated, but it works really well with Kay's. Another really great book is Till Death or Distance Do Us Part, Love and Marriage in African America by Frances Smith Foster, and she details antebellum and post-emancipation marriages among Black Americans. So the point of this is that the Freedmen's Bureau was offered as a tool to help the United States care for newly freed African Americans, but establishing the Bureau as a federal organization took some time. The Freedmen had become a burden on Congress, who wanted a regularly constituted government bureau with all the machinery and civil powers of the government behind it. So people who might listen to the Bureau's arguments, but to provide for the equal treatment of Black Americans and white Americans was beyond their imagination. If they did bring themselves to compromise very far in the direction of equality, people would rebel. So the treatment of Black civil rights varied from state to state, but the basic assumption was that African Americans were an inferior class subject to legal difficulties that were not applied to white men. Isaac Foreman, a slave who had escaped to freedom, wrote, "What is freedom to me," wrote Isaac Foreman, "when I know that my wife is in slavery?" He wrote this in 1854 when he escaped to Canada after being formerly enslaved in Norfolk, Virginia. We do not know if he was ever reunited with his wife. So, enslaved struggles for autonomy were waged on the grounds of another battle for control over social space, a terrain that slaves had to share with owners. Examples are found in secret romantic unions and public romantic unions, which I'll detail a bit more about in a bit. By problematizing our conception of autonomy, especially in regard to antebellum studies, we have what is a useful approach in analyzing the slave experience. Instead of asserting that marriage is the only acceptable romantic relationship for Black people, we have to have a more nuanced understanding of what we like to call intimate relations. So, for example, enslaved people made special distinctions between different types of romantic relationships. Sweethearting was reserved for the young, and they were free from neighborhood sanctions. Another type of intimate relation was called taking up. And taking up was informal as well, but meant for more mature couples prepared to submit to their neighbors in formal recognition. Living together was permanent, and it entitled men and women to share a surname as well as a cabin. A formal recognition of weddings would distinguish marriage from taking up. And while there was an overlap between categories, but what distinguished them was how slaves and owners sanctioned these unions. For example, slaveholders could not separate Christian marriage from legal marriage in the antebellum period and the rights and privileges it conferred. Therefore, it was impossible for enslaved people to truly marry. However, enslaved people believed that a husband and a wife ought to stay together by rights, but not as a right in a law that belonged to them. Weddings brought to force the underlying purpose of the entire structure of intimate relations. Of course, this is a fairly heteronormative and pseudo-Christian analysis of intimate relations. So there's obviously different interpretations of marriage and love and taking up that can be included here. Just as a brief note on that. Anyways, weddings, regardless of whether an owner sanctioned them, put bonds between enslaved people that was not subject to negotiation or intervention with their owners. Back to Bentley's book about the Freedmen's Bureau, he states that the Bureau find it extremely difficult to prevent what they perceived as desertion and polygamy among their charges, referring to recently freed enslaved people, and made very slow progress towards ending the recent enslaved practice of taking up with a woman rather than marrying a wife. So what happened essentially was, after emancipation, the Freedmen's Bureau made an effort to reunite families and also sanction marriages because in their view, marriage was what was legitimate. However, as we know, with family separation and running away and the sale of family members, children, spouses, oftentimes forms of intimate relations among enslaved people would not remain intact. So what they viewed as polygamy might be a person taking another spouse without a formal divorce or a formal dissolution of an intimate relation with another enslaved person. Of course, as we know, these legal proceedings were not available to them. So it's entirely in the view of the Freedmen's Bureau that those intimate relations were not valid. So where the Freedmen's Bureau falls short, there's an alternative approach that gives a fuller picture to the search for family. Understanding the distinctions between how family and marriage and love was constructed, that's important to understand before we can discuss the search for family and reunification. In Frances Foster's "Till Death Do Us Part," she presents realities about Black life in early America that are inconsistent with conventional beliefs about love and marriage. Myths and stories are the most effective means for conceptualizing and controlling ideas and ideals, ethics, and actions. And Foster goes on to argue for more nuance, as I've already mentioned, for Black Americans to reclaim their stories so we can understand those different concepts of love and marriage and sexual morality outside the guides of the Freedmen's Bureau or a whitewashed version of history. So, back to the original question. How did enslaved people construct romantic relationships? We can look at slave narratives for a clue. For example, I don't know if y'all have ever heard of Henry Bibb, but he was a formerly enslaved person who provided a narrative with an example of profound love and devotion between married couples. And this is something we don't typically see in other accounts of enslaved marriages or enslaved relations. During his first marriage to a woman named Melinda, who lived on another plantation, this might also be known as an abroad marriage, Bibb convinced his owner to sell him to another owner who lived closer to Melinda. Bibb let us know that the owner had little or no choice. The owner knew that if he made Henry Bibb leave, Bibb would simply run away. He would eventually be bought by Melinda's owner, but they would again be separated after a failed attempt to escape. Despite this, Henry Bibb escaped from Louisiana again and again, and he returned for his wife and daughter each time. All in all, he ran away 6 times and returned each time to rescue his wife. Bibb was by no means the only person who leveraged his freedom in order to preserve his family. But because of the extreme emotional and physical abuse he suffered as a result, he remains a standout example. In other instances, individuals may not have gone to such spectacular lengths to preserve love and family, but the heroic efforts to rescue or redeem husbands, wives, children, and other loved ones were not unusual. The history of enslaved marriage is a complex one and demonstrates that slaves could and did marry, that slave marriages were valued, that self-esteem was possible, and that love among slaves could and often did last despite distance and beyond death. There's another book I'd like to recommend to everyone by Tara Hunter. That's T-E-R-A Hunter. Her book is Bound in Wedlock, Slave and Free Black Marriage in the 19th Century. Her book deals with the emotional toll of marriage under slavery and what that toll took on enslaved people. Hunter brings the pain of separation into a larger perspective, reminding us that large planters often spread their slaves across multiple farms and plantations, some adjoining one another, others in different states, and even in the Caribbean. The figures are equally devastating in her book. Where people were sent and how they were separated could be affected by economics and the needs of white families. 1/3 of first marriages were disrupted by the interstate slave trade, and many more were broken apart by temporary loans and hiring out. Slave traders were mercurial, and they would try to avoid purchasing other families or entire families. They looked for individuals or partial families. The slaveholding system functioned and relied upon family separation. It required emotional destruction to be successful, and therefore could not confer the legal rights and protections of Christian marriage upon enslaved people. So we have these examples of separated spouses when we talk about the search for family. Formerly enslaved people searched for those they had not seen in decades or would carry on searching for years at a time. They would witness husbands seeking out information about the whereabouts of their wives, and wives were seen advertising for news of their long-lost husbands. Again, that's more of a heteronormative, pseudo-Christian example, and this is not meant to delegitimize other forms of love and marriage. For example, we can think of the story of John and Elizabeth Boston, who were separated when John escaped to freedom. "I can address God as a free man," John wrote in a letter to his wife, having found refuge at a Union camp. "But my dear, I can't express my great desire that I have to see you. I trust the time will come when we shall meet again." So ultimately, family separation was a common experience in 19th century Black America. Many marriages in the antebellum United States, including those among free people, were disrupted or destroyed by a spouse going to a different place and the couple knowing or believing that the separation was final. To bring it back to the impropriety of weddings at Plantation Sites, I've included a few reviews at Plantation Sites written by people who went for the tour, and I'll read them now. The lack of a comprehensive picture of plantation life is in part due to the exclusion of the enslaved experience. Allowing plantations to be used as event venues only contributes to the whitewashing of history. The continued whitewashing may be a consequence of making these sites event spaces instead of accurate historical records. So this person wrote that they and their husband were extremely disappointed in this tour. They didn't come to hear a lecture on how the white people treated slaves. We came to get this history of a Southern plantation and get a tour of the house and grounds. The tour guide was so radical about slave treatment, we felt we were being lectured and bashed about slavery. My ancestors were from Sicily, never owned slaves, and my husband's were German, and none of his ever owned slaves. I am by far not a racist or against Americans having equal rights. But this was my vacation, and now we are crossing all plantation tours off our list. It was just not what we expected. I'll go back to Louisiana and see some real plantations that are so much more enjoyable to tour. Another review stated that I don't recommend the tour as it is highly politicized and geared mostly towards civil rights and slave suffrage. Our guide Olivia offered a heavy bias with the only hand-picked facts that neatly fit her narrative and for a large part weren't germane to a plantation tour. I found it amusing when she told us some freed slaves fled to northern cities like Baltimore and Detroit, where they continued to thrive to this day. So obviously, we've got some severely ahistorical statements here, and one way to combat that is through better and more inclusive education, especially through public history. So the way we interact with the public does not necessarily only include sites like plantation museums, but also through websites that might advertise plantations as wedding venues, such as The Knot and Pinterest. The Knot and Pinterest are two popular sites used by couples to plan their weddings. And a couple years ago, they came out saying that they were making changes to ensure former slave plantations weren't romanticized as wedding venues. Sorry, you guys, want to make sure I'm not behind in my presentation. Awesome, looking good, thank you. Pinterest told NBC News that weddings should be a symbol of love and unity. Plantations represent none of those things. They're grateful to Color of Change, which was an advocacy group that was responsible for running a petition to get these websites to change their policies, for bringing attention to this disrespectful practice. So Pinterest actually changed their policies to limit the distribution of plantation content. They did this by turning off search recommendations, autocomplete, and email notifications related to plantation or wedding plantation or similar searches. They also worked to de-index plantation content so it doesn't appear in online search results. I'll be honest, I haven't tried and searched for this myself, so I can't speak to the validity of that, but that was something that came out circa 2018, so if anyone's interested, y'all should check it out for yourselves. People who search for plantation-related content would see an advisory that some of the results may have violated Pinterest policies. And they also made sure that no monetary ads would show on those search results, so the company would not make money from them. The Knot, another popular wedding website, as I mentioned earlier, still allows plantations to advertise as wedding venues, but it's working with that advocacy group I mentioned, Color of Change, on new guidelines that was released later on to deal with people searching and using plantation sites as wedding venues. They work to limit the adjectives that can be used to describe a venue, and those new rules applied to all venues, not just plantations, ensuring that venue owners don't try to get around the rules by rebranding as a manor, for example. Sorry, you guys. Just totally lost my spot in my notes. Back to that advocacy group, the Color of Change reached out to other wedding sites and other companies, such as Martha Stewart Weddings, Brides Magazine, and Zola, but Pinterest and The Knot should be commended as they were the only ones to respond. The wedding industry is a big business. A few years ago, it was projected to bring in $76 billion in revenue. And obviously, the use of plantation sites as wedding venues has grown with that popularity. People, unfortunately, have a short memory about what has happened at these venues and the impact that it still currently has. All right. As I mentioned earlier, the Whitney Plantation was a plantation that had challenged some of the desire to romanticize Southern plantations. This is from their Instagram, and I'm going to head and read it now on why they don't allow weddings, because I'm not sure if you guys can see this. They said, over 350 people were enslaved at Whitney Plantation throughout the 18th and 19th centuries. Our tour has always focused on the brutal labor and stolen freedom of those that created vast economic wealth for the enslaving families. We do not glamorize the big house or the grounds. In addition to our mission to educate visitors, our site is a place of memory and reverence. Our on-site memorials list the names of individuals who were enslaved at Whitney, individuals who were enslaved throughout Louisiana, and children who died during enslavement, as well as a memorial for the revolutionaries of the largest U.S. slave revolt. For those reasons, the Big House has never been, nor ever will be, a wedding venue. Plantations are the sites of immense cruelty and violence. We do not allow any event that would overshadow this reality and disrespect the memory of all those who suffered, labored, and died here. So essentially, in conclusion, the Whitney Plantation is a great place to check out. I believe it's located in Louisiana and does a really effective job at addressing the reality of plantation life. Plantation weddings are essentially indicative of a blind spot shared by many, a willful ignorance of what plantations really were, which is they were an economic system, a business, in which profitability was linked to the forced labor of enslaved people. Plantations are the sites of violence and brutality, an enslaved labor camp with a pretty house on it. So, if you like beautiful venues, green flowering acres where people come and once toiled over sugar and tobacco, ignoring those icky parts of history, well, maybe you should have a plantation wedding. Thank you. Thank you. We have some questions. All right. Okay, first one is, what are some ways you've seen stories of love and marriage / family reclaimed, as you mentioned? Thank you. That's a really great question. First, let me say that the source space of positive or reclaimed narratives, especially for enslaved people or early Black life in America, is quite slight, so I haven't seen many. But one way is through that book that I mentioned about intimate relations and the other one about slave marriage. Those books really kind of read in between the lines of the archive to dig out what marriage and love and what that reality was like, and instead of making it kind of like a violence porn or slavery porn, have gotten at what was beautiful and that about it and what made love possible under the reality of slave life. What are your suggestions of how plantations should be used instead of celebrating them as party venues? Thank you. That's another great question. I have a lot of thoughts about that. I should note and acknowledge that obviously the reason that so many venues or so many sites are used as wedding and event venues is because there is a demand for it. And that demand for it is what keeps some of those sites up and running. I think, for one, the federal government needs to devote a lot more funding to some of these sites, at least the public ones. I'm not sure what private sites and what government funding would look like. So on a larger scale basis, that would be one suggestion or something I would like to see happen so we can help put proper money towards effective public education and effective public history. I think they should, and this kind of works in conversation with the recent debates about the Confederate flag and Confederate statues in the past few years. I think that plantation sites should remain because they are sites of history and pain, and people need to continue to be educated about those, but we need to be effective in our education. We need to be accurate to the reality of it. That's one thing that historians do, or I think like to try to do pretty well. So I hope that kind of answers your question, but those would be my recommendations. Do I believe that the use of plantations as a wedding venue is inherently racist? Yes, I would. I would say I can't say concretely that that's the only demographic, but I would say it's fairly obvious what demographic is drawn to using plantation as a wedding venue. You can think of, for example, Blake Lively and Ryan Reynolds got married at a plantation, and they came out and apologized and all that. But there's a reason why plantations are romanticized in the South, and it's to avoid and erase the history of what happened there. And that history is not only inherently American history, but Black history. So to use these sites in that way erases the history of Black people, the history of America, as a country and as a slaveholding state. So I would say that it is. Yeah. How can we get the wedding industry to discourage plantation weddings? That's another great question. Thank you. I personally am a big fan of like from the ground up activism. So I think not only do we need more engagement with plantation sites, as sites of historic memory, as sites as museums, but people need to address these sites themselves and kind of call them out, or at least question, why is this what you're doing? Why is this the way to go? And there have been sites that, in response to visitor questions and visitor complaints, that have made an effort to, if not end their site's use as a venue, to give a more accurate representation of enslaved history and to remember the people who labored there. A great example of that is the Hermitage in Nashville, Tennessee. That's Andrew Jackson's plantation. I might be wrong on that. I'm pretty sure it's Andrew Jackson. They are still used as a wedding venue, but they have been very open about their efforts to remember the slave population that was there and the fact that it was largely brought about by visitors. Okay. Thank you. Yeah. Okay, thank you everyone for attending.